Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid. Oh, nice if I put my microphone in front of my mouth. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to read another selection from Greg Egan's Instantiation short story collection. This week we've got, if I can not flip past it, Seventh Sight. And Mr. Egan is going to take us on a magic carpet ride, as it were. What is the one after this? I might do two. This one's pretty short. No, that one is long. Okay. We'll just do that next week. Whatever. Very short one this week. Sorry. Um, this is why once I'm done with oh come on now, what's it called? A Hero Born, the Legends of the Condor Heroes, book one. Um, Once I'm done with that on Wednesdays, I'll probably start doing some of these on Wednesdays as well, just to bang through it a little faster, because we got quite a few stories left. Oh, geez, next week's is going to be dark. It's going to be dark. Um, but this week's is less dark. Very short and sweet. What can I do to fill time for this week? Because I'm going to be done this in like an hour. Are there any other short ones I can bang out? Give me a sec. Oh, that one's pretty short. What page was that on? Thank goodness he has a table of contents for these. I'm sorry. This is a tad embarrassing. Where are you? How are you? Oh, no, that's longer than it claimed. Ah. You know what? We'll do that one too. Tentatively, we'll do that one too. Okay. So yeah, let's get cracking on Seventh Sight. There are some interesting ones, short stories in this collection. We've got some more fun ahead. Seventh Sight by Greg Egan. Chapter 1. On my 12th birthday, my cousin Sean sent me the keys to the Rainbow. I carried them around in my phone for 6 days, unused, burning a hole in my pocket. Sean had hacked his own implants almost 18 months before, so I was fairly sure that it would be safe to follow him, but I couldn't begin to imagine what would happen if my father caught me rewiring my retinas. I waited for a Sunday afternoon when my parents were preoccupied with a movie. I closed the door to my room and drew the curtains. The door had no lock, so I lay in bed with my head under the covers, staring at my phone until the screen went dark. In the blackness, I thought about my grandfather, blinded by nothing more than the gene we shared, but sightless for so long that the implants had been powerless to bring him back into the light. My confidence in the trail Sean had blazed began to waver. His implants and mine were the same model, but everyone's body was unique. I did not want to end up blind, and even if the changes I wrought were reversible with a trip to the optometrist to restore my implant settings, that was not something I could do without my parents finding out. I jiggled the phone and lit it up again, showing the circular rainbow of the app's startup screen. The hues in this fanciful icon were crisper and clearer than those of any rainbow I'd seen in the sky, but then my bio-sighted friends had assured me that they could never make out the mythical 7 colors either, and I had no reason to doubt them. My implants did their best to mimic the color vision of the human eye, but matching the typical responses of the three kinds by matching the typical responses of the 3 kinds of human cone cells. But this mimicry was a matter of choice, not necessity, and I wouldn't need any new hardware inside my skull in order to move beyond it. The quantum dots scattered across my artificial retinas included millions of spares, ready to step in if any of the currently active sensors failed. These spares were not pre-committed to any particular color, lest the demand for replacements skewed green or blue and left the red ones wasting space, like some unpopular flavor of Skittles. But since the choice was made, not with pigment molecules or colored filters, but by setting a series of voltages across a quantum well, there was nothing to constrain the possibilities to the 3 traditional colors. The app Sean had sent me could instruct the implants to wake all my spares, and tune them to 4 new bands, between and beyond the original 3. I ran a fingertip along the rainbow's edge, trying to reach a decision. The implants made me normal. They allowed me to fit in. Why ask for anything more? Left to my biological fate, I would not have been fully blind for another decade, but my parents had opted for a replacement as early as possible, giving me the best chance of adapting to the device. But that had been 6 years ago. If I didn't try this experiment now, while my brain was still flexible enough to make sense of the new information, I might die without ever knowing what I'd missed. I lifted my finger from its stalling arc and tapped the button above. Continue. The app needed to know the implant's serial numbers and service password, but both were printed plainly in my owner's manual. The manufacturer's warranty had expired, leaving nothing to void, and the app's screed claimed it could hide its actions from any health professional making routine adjustments. So long as nothing went wrong that I couldn't fix by sending the spares back to sleep, there was a chance that my spectral trespasses would remain undetected. The next screen showed response curves. The standard red and green ones already overlapped considerably, while the blue ones stood almost aloof from them. The app's default choice was to squeeze 2 new curves in between blue and green, and then add one at the near-infrared end and one at the near-ultraviolet. There was also a set of default opposition formulas, which specified the way in which information was to be extracted from various combinations of the new primary colors, just as the difference between the red and green responses was computed in every human eye and passed along to the brain. The idea of editing any of these details, adding my own idiosyncratic twist to the process, made my hands sweat. I would not have known where to start constructing my own private notion of the ideal palette. But if that also proved, but if that also proved that I was in no position to make an informed choice to accept the defaults, I took some comfort from the orderly appearance of the 7 curves on offer. They covered the spectrum, evenly and efficiently, each little hill in the serried row peaking at a wavelength some 50 nanometers away from its neighbor. Nothing about them looked strange, demanding elaborate justifications from the depths of biophysics. Nothing cried out to be changed. I hit accept and moved on to the next page. Warning! Activating and retuning spare sensors in your artificial retinas, or ARs, may lead to permanent changes in your brain's visual pathways. While this app can restore the ARs to their original state, we make no such promises about your visual cortex. The decision is yours alone. The Rainbow Project. This disclaimer did not unnerve me at all. That the brain was altered by the information it did or didn't receive was old news to me, writ large in my family's history. The implants had come just in time to help my father, but not as much as they had helped me, and my uncles and cousins of various ages joined up the dots. The more I thought about it, the surer I became that the most frightening thing would be to lose this chance, while Sean and his friends sprinted far ahead of me and disappeared into the far end of the rainbow. I tapped Proceed. The warning gave way to a flickering Bluetooth icon and a progress bar. I watched the text above the bar spelling out the stages as the app and implants worked together, cataloging the spare sensors, testing them internally, retuning them, testing them again. The progress bar paused at 95%. Then the app asked me if the sky was clear and I'd obtained a suitable prism. It was, and I had. I climbed out of bed and opened the curtains to admit a narrow wedge of sunlight. Then I placed the prism Sean had given me on my desk and moved it back and forth until the spectrum it cast on the wall formed an uninterrupted band. Following the app's instructions, I turned my head slowly, shifting my gaze steadily across the spectrum from left to right, starting just before the red end. In my earbuds, the app counted down the nanometers as it verified its tweaks to the quantum dots at every wavelength. It was all reassuringly mundane, like a human version of the procedure after changing an ink cartridge, where you print and scan an alignment page. The app said, "Done." I looked down at my phone, and the progress bar had reached 100%. The image zoomed out to show the circular rainbow again. Then it shrank to a point, and the app quit, taking me back to the phone's home screen. I opened the curtains and let the sunlight fill my room. Nothing looked different. I'd been warned that any change in the way I perceived the world could take days or weeks. But my impatience was offset by a sense of relief. Whatever else I'd done, at least I hadn't damaged the implants and left myself blind. Sorry about that. I thought I had unmuted myself. I did not. "These flowers are dying," I told my father as I set the table for dinner. "Do you want me to throw them out?" "Dying?" He stepped out of the kitchen and peered at the centerpiece, then came closer and examined the individual blooms. "They're fine, Jake. What are you talking about?" "Sorry," I said stupidly. "It must have been a trick of the light." He frowned, puzzled, but then went back to draining vegetables. I fetched my mother and my sister, and we all sat down to eat. Throughout the meal I kept stealing glances at the flowers. My father grew a few different kinds in a small garden at the front of the house, and though I'd never taken much interest in them, I couldn't help but be familiar with their appearance at various stages of health and decay. In fact, these daffodils hadn't even wilted. The petals were firm, not drooping. Yet the uniform yellow I was accustomed to had been modified by a flared pattern that I'd mistaken for a kind of withering, with streaks radiating out from the center of each flower that looked like shadows, not so much discolored as subdued. It was only when I stopped worrying about the flowers and paid attention to my family that I realized how far the change had progressed. My father's face looked as if he'd developed a rash, albeit with a strong left-right symmetry, his cheeks flushed red, and a roseate Rorschach blot decorating his temple. But if the effect was disconcertingly close to bad TV alien makeup, my mother and sister wore much the same mask with a twist. Their actual cosmetics, which I usually barely noticed, now looked as if they'd been applied by an eager 4-year-old who'd viewed the process as a form of finger painting. Streaks and ridges stood out all over their faces. It was all I could do to keep myself from staring, or making some inane, self-incriminating joke by asking them whether they'd enjoyed their mud baths. After dinner, the four of us sat down to watch a sitcom, giving me an excuse to keep my eyes on the screen instead of the garish people around me. But the longer I spent gazing at the electronic image, the flatter its colors seemed, until the live action began to resemble some kind of stylized animation. It was not that I'd yet started to think of my family's facial decorations as normal, but the actors' skin tones looked as plastic as any mannequins, and the sets around them like the pastel storybook castles from a children's show. I only had to glance across at the couch on which my parents sat to see how much richer and subtler the hues of the simplest real object could be. In my bed, I lay awake wondering whether I should restore the implants to their original state. If I'd wanted everyone around me to look like a clown, there was an app that daubed face paint over the image from my phone's camera, but the novelty of that had worn off in half an hour when I was 8 years old. I couldn't believe that my 14-year-old cousin had talked me into imagining that I'd be joining some kind of sophisticated elite. Just before midnight, I messaged Sean. "This is horrible. Everything looks ugly. Why did you make me do it?" He replied, "Be patient. Wait a week. If you still don't like it, it's not too late to go back." I stared into the shadows, still feeling cheated. But I'd been a trichromat for 12 years. I needed to give myself a chance to wrap my mind around the new sensorium. As I placed the phone on my bedside table, I suddenly realized how much more clearly than usual I was perceiving the details of the room. It was not that I'd magically acquired thermal night vision. Nothing cooler than a clothes iron would emit the kind of infrared my sensors could pick up. But traces of illumination from a neighbor's house were spilling through the gaps around my curtain, and though once this would have granted me nothing more than a few impressionistic hints in gray, sorry. And though once this would have granted me nothing more than a few impressionistic hints in gray, the Rainbow app had transformed the view, imbuing it with a subtle palette of colors that made every object stand out from the gloom. The effect wasn't comical or ugly. It felt as if I was seeing more deeply into the night world, sharpening its edges without diminishing its allure. I fell asleep and dreamed that I was flying across the neighborhood, an eagle-eyed raptor dragging secrets out of the darkness. The next few days of school were an exercise in learning not to stare at stained clothes and strangely spackled faces, let alone display any stronger reaction that might lead to violence, disciplinary action, or just the dangerously unanswerable question, "What's so funny?" Whenever the temptation to smirk at a particularly zombie-esque schoolmate or Revlon-bombed teacher threatened to overpower me, I reminded myself that I looked every bit as ridiculous. I didn't need a mirror, Just glancing down at my just glancing down at the sweat marks on my shirt, which resembled the gray silt left behind by retreating floodwaters, brought a pang of humiliation that was enough to wipe the smile from my lips. Every painted wall looked slapdash and dirty, and even bare brickwork seemed to be decaying, infested with some toxic new form of mold. A part of me understood full well that this riot of variegation wasn't really so wild, that the 18 or 20 different tones I could discern on the surface of every brick all still belonged to what I all still belonged to what I once sorry that the 18 or 20 different tones I could discern on the surface of every brick all still belonged to what I would once have seen and named as exactly the same shade of red. But it was impossible to shake the impression that these newly revealed distinctions had to mean something. A once uniform surface that had turned mottled couldn't possibly hold together for long, and one good kick ought to be enough to break it apart like a rotten floorboard. The sky did not look blemished, but when I gazed at any part of its gentle gradient, I knew exactly where the sun lay, and before long I could also judge the time of day to the nearest half hour. Sky blue was still sky blue, but now it came in 100 delicate rings centered on the solar disk, and then imprinted with a second, subtler pattern, whose bullseye was the zenith. 11 a.m. had a mood of its own now, as distinct from noon as sunset or dawn. The following Sunday, Sean asked me to meet him at the beach. On the bus to the coast, I stared out at the car yards and advertising signs. Even the brand new BMWs looked like grubby plastic shells torn from some fairground ride, and the art-directed posters might have been lifted from a therapeutic crayon sketching session at a hospital for the criminally tasteless. The strange blush of real human skin was growing on me, though. When I glanced across the aisle at a teenaged girl, her eyes closed as she listened to a track whose pounding bass leaked out from her skull and crossed the gap between us. There was nothing comical or repellent about the visible ebb and flow in the capillaries below her cheekbones. I waited by the roadside for someone's older brother to drop off Sean and 3 friends with their surfboards. As we walked through the dunes, Sean let the others get ahead of us. "How's it looking now?" he asked. "Better, I suppose." His own face was smeared with sunscreen, but there was an eerie precision to each daub. If I had not already known that we were seeing the world through identical eyes, this would have proved it. I looked around at the low, sturdy bushes that anchored the dunes. Their small, dark green leaves weren't much different than I remembered them. "At least I'm not freaking out all the time." "Good." He was smiling sneakily, as if he had a handful of something unpleasant hidden behind his back that he was about to bring forward and drop down the neck of my t-shirt. "What?" I asked, getting ready to retreat. We came over the top of the dunes. My skin turned to ice, and my bowels loosened. Mercifully, they had nothing to expel. The ocean stretched out before us, as alien as if our last dozen steps had carried us 1,000 light years. But then, even more alarmingly, the impossibly rich skeins of currents and ripples, patches of seaweed and changes of depth and turbidity, flexed like a vacillating optical illusion, and settled firmly inside my old memories of the scene. What I perceived was no longer extraterrestrial. This was the same blue-green, white-foamed water I'd known all my life. Only now, without ever stepping outside the borders of its familiar colors, it was inscribed and annotated with such a richness of new detail that it was like holding up the palm of my hand to find my entire life story, in a million words and illustrations, discernible in the whorls and ridges of the skin. One of Sean's friends called out to him impatiently, and he broke into a run. I watched him dragging his board into the surf. That wasn't my thing, but I could imagine, just barely, what he would make of the revelations that the ocean offered up to every glance. As I waded into the breaking waves, I ducked down and splashed water on my face to make sure that no one would notice my tears. This was what it meant to see the world. This was my escape from the terror of blindness, from the family curse clawing at my heels. Not the first, too forgiving childhood version, when they'd unwrapped my bandages and over 3 long months taught me to turn a blur of muddy colors into the pale glimpse of reality that I'd naively accepted as the thing itself. As I moved my hands through the swell, overwhelmed by the density of greens within green, for a second or two, or perhaps a whole minute, I actually believed that I'd been lied to, that everyone on Earth saw things this way, except for the poor fools with artificial eyes, who, if forced from a young enough age to lower their expectations, had no idea what they'd been missing. But as this momentary delusion passed and my unwarranted anger dissipated, the inverted truth that replaced it was almost as disorienting. The world before me remained, undeniably, the world as it needed to be seen. And those to whom it was unreachable were as helpless and pitiful as if their empty sockets had been filled with glass or stone. "2 p.m., Sunday the 4th," I muttered. "What?" Mehdi followed my gaze, but saw nothing that could have prompted these words. "Forget it." The message was painted clearly on the billboard we were passing, painted over a patch of blue in other shades of blue. In the small park the billboard overlooked, I could see more heptachromatic graffiti on benches and playground equipment, but I forced myself to stop staring and walk on. "What did you think, Jake?" Dylan pressed me. Everyone else had spent the last 10 minutes raving about the movie, but I'd kept my mouth shut. "It was all right," I conceded.
All right.
Quan glared at me as if I'd just spat on his shoes.
It was incredible.
Okay. Dylan, Mehdi, and Quan had been my friends for years, and we'd got into the habit of seeing all the new 3D blockbusters together. I'd come along to this latest action flick because I hadn't wanted to offend them, but I'd known from the start that all the stunts and effects that might once have been breathtaking would be lost on me.
When they lassoed his helicopter from the train and he slid down the rope and jumped through that window,
Mehdi thumped his chest emphatically.
It was like doing the whole thing yourself for real.
"Yeah," I lied. "That was cool." The honest thing would have been to admit how phony every last scene had appeared to me. And why. I couldn't risk news of my alteration getting back to my parents, but I had no reason to believe that my friends would betray me. The truth was, I didn't want them to know what I'd done. What was the point, when they had no hope of understanding it? The next weekend, I told my parents I was seeing another movie. I arrived at the park at 1:15. It was empty of people, but the same message was still there on the billboard. I hunted for some of the smaller scrawls I'd noticed in passing. "Hep rules" and "Four more fears" were drawn repeatedly in ornate, almost indecipherable scripts, the style and colors the same each time. I was staring at one of these tags on a bench when someone spoke behind me.
You want that as a tattoo?
I turned. It was a girl, not much older than me. "Do you sterilize your needles?" I asked. She laughed.
I didn't mean permanent.
"One day, maybe." She was carrying a backpack, holding its shoulder straps in her hand. She hefted it onto the bench and unzipped it.
I made the inks myself, she said, taking out a small bottle. 6 months of trial and error.
I peered into the backpack. There must have been 40 vials in there. That's a lot of work.
The hard part is finding 2 or 3 that will be invisible to tries on lots of different backgrounds.
How can you tell? I wondered. She took out her phone, tapped the screen, and held it up, showing me its graffiti-free image of the bench. I felt my face flush at the stupidity of my question, and knowing how that would look only
And knowing how that would look only intensified the response.
Why did you come early? She asked. That spoils the fun.
You're early too, I countered.
I'm not early. I'm here to mark the trail.
I'd half guessed that this would be some kind of treasure hunt. So you're in charge? She nodded.
My name's Lucy. I'm Jake. Do you want to help me?
Sure. A family had come into the park, a couple and two young kids, heading for the swings. The mother watched us suspiciously as Lucy took out a camel's hair brush and began painting on a corner of the billboard. But we weren't wielding spray cans, and our watercolor vandalism seemed to be having no effect at all.
3 blocks north, then turn left, Lucy wrote. Listen for the sound of squealing brakes. Let's go, she said, handing me the backpack. You can carry this if you like.
We set out across the city, starting with a nearby amusement arcade. There was a Formula One game close to the western entrance, the sound effects blaring out onto the street. Lucy squatted down beside the wall and asked me for number 23. The vials in her backpack had been sorted into 4 separate pouches, making it easier to find each one. A few passers-by looked at us askance, but if Lucy's brushstrokes left no mark, it was hardly a police matter. I raised my phone and viewed the scene through eyes. She seemed to be delicately cleaning the brown-painted bricks. When she handed the ink back to me, I looked at the label more carefully. Cinnamon and cloves? That's what's in here?
No, that's just how I think of it.
I turned back to the words she had written on the wall of the arcade.
East until you hit stale bread.
I doubted that I'd seen many spices in bulk since I'd run the Rainbow app, but even if there was no literal resemblance, the name did evoke the hue, a rich, sharp brown that ought to have smelled of those aromatic ingredients. Then what's it made of?
Lucy smiled. I'm not telling you. Work it out for yourself.
She glanced at her watch.
We need to keep moving.
She let me paint the last clue, and the arrow that marked the treasure, though I needed her advice on the color schemes. The loot itself was a sheet of paper that she stuffed inside an empty toilet roll and hid behind a bush in a courtyard outside the museum.
What does that number mean?
A long string of letters and digits had been written on the paper, in what I assumed was tri-invisible ink.
It's a kind of code, Lucy explained. If you type it into the website, you get another number that lets you prove that you were the winner.
You built your own website for this? She shook her head, amused.
It's for anyone. Tries play something similar, but they usually do it with GPS and AR. There are no real-world clues, but you can see them with your phone or your glasses.
So do you stay here and watch? I asked. See how long people take?
Sometimes. We can do that if you like.
We sat on a bench with a view of the hiding place. 15 minutes later, a skinny young boy on a skateboard rolled up and went straight for the prize. When he'd received it, Lucy cupped her hands around her mouth and called out to him, "Well done, Tim!" Tim skated across the courtyard to join us, thumbing numbers into his phone as he went. He looked about 10, which made me uneasy. Sean had implied that there was some unwritten code fixing the minimum age for the hack at 12. As Lucy was introducing us, 2 other competitors showed up. Before long, there were a dozen people gathered around the bench, debating the merits of the hunt and cracking the kind of jokes about the ramshackle city and its hapless tries that would have been wasted in any other company. Tim was the youngest, but I'd have guessed that nobody was older than 14. I stayed quiet, conscious of my position as a newcomer, though nobody showed any sign of snubbing me. As the afternoon wore on and people left, the dome of the sky seemed tinged with melancholy. When only Lucy and I were left, she read my thoughts.
You think you've lost all your old friends, she said, and a few random heps are no replacement.
I shrugged, embarrassed.
You haven't lost anyone, she said. It's good to get together with the rainbow crowd, but no one's forcing you to be a snob about it. Would your friends have dumped you if you'd gone blind?
I shook my head, ashamed.
Have you told anyone? I asked her. Any of your tri-friends? No.
But I still hang out with them. I just have to hold my tongue and not offer too many fashion tips. Her own clothing appeared as grimy as anyone else's, and the technology to make it otherwise probably didn't exist outside of NASA clean rooms. But I could see her harmonious choices in the elements she could control. "We do this on the first Sunday of every month," she said. "Tim will be marking the course next time, but if you like, we could team up and follow the clues together." I said, "That sounds good." Chapter 2. "Call," I declared. If I couldn't quite keep my tone neutral, the faint tell in my voice sounded more like fear than confidence. Danny could only make three of a kind, and Cheng the same, albeit higher, while the dark-eyed woman who never gave her name could rise above them both with a straight. Everyone else at the table had folded, some of them needlessly. In that company, my own modest flush was a sure bet, but the last thing I felt was invincible. Danny folded. Cheng raised the bet to sorry. Cheng raised the bet by 50. Then the dark-eyed woman raised it another 50. I agonized for 5 long seconds. My rule was never to win more than 1,000 a night, and this would push me over the limit. But if I folded now, I would have spent 8 hours in this dispiriting place for the sake of just $300. I slid my chips forward, matching the bet. Cheng shot an irritated glance my way and folded. The dark-eyed woman raised, again. Her face was so impassive that I began to doubt, if not the evidence of my own eyes, then that of my memory. I didn't dare glance down at the backs of her cards again, but I was certain that one bore the twisted hourglass stain in the lacquer that I'd noticed on the 5 of clubs in the showdown before last, while the other had a florid tint to half its royal blue ink that had been unmissable when the 6 of hearts had come my way much earlier in the night. In this back alley game they did not change the decks between every hand, and even if I could have missed the dealer feeding a fresh pack into the shuffling machine, no two decks ever featured identical flaws. So either I'd grown confused as to the significance of the blemishes I'd seen, or my opponent was very good at bluffing. "I'll match," I said, offering up the chips. The dark-eyed woman allowed herself a triumphant smile as she showed her cards. 5 of clubs, 6 of hearts. With the 7, 8, and 9 of diamonds in the flop, she had a straight, but nothing better. The relief on my own face wasn't feigned. I turned up my 3 and 6 of diamonds. The woman's lingering smile made me wonder if the loss had even registered before the dealer raked the pot and sent the rest in my direction. But perhaps the secret to her bluff had been a kind of self-hypnotic conviction that her hand was unbeatable, and it took a few seconds to snap out of it and allow the truth to sink in. I scooped up my winnings and rose from the table. "Hey, Jay!" Danny was scowling at me. "Give me a chance to win it back." He was drunk, and he hadn't done well all night. I checked my watch and shook my head apologetically. "Next week, I promise." I took my chips to the cashier and glanced back at the table. Danny was staying put to try his luck with the late crowd. As I walked to my car, I skirted 3 glistening patches on the ground. The streetlights were sparse here, but the neon fronts of the nightclubs in the adjoining strip were enough to illuminate the residual bloodstains that spring rain seemed merely to rearrange, and no try felt compelled to scrub away. It was almost 4 a.m. when I got home, but Lucy was still up. "How'd it go?" she asked. I showed her my winnings, fanning out the notes so she could count them at a glance. Lucy had had her misgivings from the start, but now she seemed more anxious than ever. "I don't want you ending up in prison, or worse." "It wouldn't come to that. There's nothing they could prove. They'd just ban me. I slumped onto the couch. You should be in bed, I chided her. Unless I'd become so confused by the card room's time-distorting ambiance that I'd lost a day, she was due at work in less than 5 hours. And what if you do get banned? She persisted. I never win enough to look suspicious. Heps were far too rare to pose much of a threat, and even the high-end casinos could hardly scan everyone's skulls with MRI machines. The small games I joined were run by people who were very far from amateurs, but so long as I could retain enough self-discipline not to overplay my advantage, I felt sure that I could hide in the statistical shadows of the merely lucky. Lucy said, "The gallery's letting me go at the end of the month." That shook me. Whatever fate I was courting, her own use of her talents could not have been more honest. What are they going to replace you with? A mass spectrometer? Not quite, she replied, but there's some new software that pretty much does what I do, with a multispectral camera and brushstroke analysis. They can lease the whole thing for a tenth of my salary. The gallery had only given her 3 days a week since she'd come back from maternity leave, but she still earned about as much as I dared acquire by my own methods. We're such fuck-ups, she said angrily. That's not true. She turned away from me and gazed with loathing at one of her own paintings. A city threatened by fire, the skyscrapers scintillating through the smoke haze, every blistering current of air as palpable as the freeways below. I kept kidding myself that I had a foot in the door, but I might as well have been a kitchen hand, pretending that I was on some fast track to chef just because I could sniff out bad produce a little sooner than anyone else. So they've found some machine to help them assess provenance, I said. That doesn't take anything away from your paintings. Lucy laughed bitterly. If I couldn't sell anything even when I had connections, what do you think my chances are going to be now? What are you saying? I pressed her, aiming for a gently skeptical tone. It's all down to nepotism? No, she admitted. The work does matter, but it's going to be harder than ever to get it seen. I was trying to be the voice of reason, calmly talking her back from the edge. But the trouble was, she understood the problems she was facing far better than I did. For an art dealer to look at a painting is some kind of special favor? Yes, Lucy declared bluntly. For a try to look carefully enough to see a tenth of what's there takes something special. That doesn't happen as a matter of course. I spread my arms in resignation and went to take a shower. On my way to bed, I looked in on Zelda. She'd slept through all the talking, and I resisted the urge to lean down and kiss her, lest she wake and start bawling. Zelda was almost 6 months old, so we only had 6 more to decide whether or not to give her the gene therapy vector. After that point, the quality of the repaired retinal cells would start to fall off with time. If she was going to be a try at all, I wanted her at least to have the sharpest vision that state could entail. 5 years before, when I'd moved in with Lucy, we'd sworn that we'd never sentence our children to live in the flat, cartoonish world that we'd escaped. But while Sean was still winning titles as a pro surfer, most of us had ended up struggling, thwarted or resentful. When I could count the number of Heps I'd grown up with who had truly flourished on the fingers of one hand, how could I bequeath the same prospects to my daughter? I'll see that, and I'll raise you 50, Marcus announced. I'd folded a few rounds ago, after forcing myself to stay in and lose a little for appearance's sake. Now there were only 2 players left, and they seemed to be intent on a game of chicken. I'll match, Danny replied. His hand was terrible, but at some point he must have convinced himself that he could bluff his way to victory, and having chosen that strategy, he was too stubborn to veer off course. Marcus raised another 50. Fuck you, Danny whispered, and matched the bet. I watched them with a growing sense of dread, willing Marcus to back down. I hadn't set eyes on him before that night, so I could still imagine that it was possible. Danny would just keep charging ahead like a freight train. I guess I'll have to raise you again, Marcus taunted him. Danny slid the last of his chips forward. Matched. Marcus hesitated. I'm good, he decided. Danny laid down his pair of nines, which made two pairs beside the kings in the flop. Marcus had a king and a queen in the hole, giving him trips. I could have made the same, but only with sevens. Everyone else had had rubbish. The dealer took the house cut and slid the rest toward Marcus. Cheat, Danny said softly. Excuse me? Marcus smiled and looked around the table. No one was backing Danny. You should call it a night. Come back when your luck's better. Danny leaned forward. Risk all that on a trip? I don't think so. The dealer said, Sir, please. Marcus gave an indignant bark of a laugh. And look what you risked the same on. But you didn't need to, Danny countered. If you'd raised again, you knew I couldn't match it. I didn't know what was in your wallet, Marcus blustered. You could have borrowed from someone. I'm not a mind reader. I could see the blood draining from his face, and I understood. Somehow, he really had known Danny's hand all along, and he'd betrayed himself just so he could twist the knife. Danny reached across the table and plucked Marcus's glasses from his face, like some curiously gentlemanly preamble to a pounding. The dealer raised his hand to summon a bouncer, but Danny didn't hit anyone. He simply perched the glasses on his own nose and looked down at the table. I know it, he declared triumphantly. He removed the glasses and offered them to the dealer. Every card has a number in green. The dealer hesitated, then tried on the glasses for himself. Okay, he said nervously. Everyone stay seated. The game's annulled, and you're all getting your bets returned. Two bouncers and the manager joined us as the eye-in-the-sky vision was replayed and the chips were redistributed. Marcus sat in silence, his face blotched with fear. I knew the cards weren't marked with any kind of die. His glasses had to be finding the same pre-existing subtleties as I was. Then making the job easier for him by numbering the patterns in an overlay laser painted on his retinas. I'd noticed the small dark circle in the center of the bridge, but I hadn't given it much thought. Molded plastic always came with all kinds of odd impressions that its makers fancied were invisible. It was clear now, though, exactly what it was: a tiny, multispectral camera, with sensors exactly like the ones in my own eyes. When I got home, the apartment was in darkness, so I took off my shoes and sat in the living room, planning to sleep on the couch. I was only 29. My life was hardly over. Thousands of people slacked off in high school, dropped out of university, quit their first few jobs, and still found a way to succeed in the end. If I'd wanted the one thing that lifted me above the crowd to be a part of the answer, too bad. No one was going to pay me to see the world more clearly than they did, let alone stand by and let me use that talent to fleece them. Lucy could paint her paintings for our tiny circle of hep friends, and we could walk side by side, marveling at the beauty of the sea and the sky and the squalor of the city. But in the end, our powers of vision would die with us, outsourced entirely to unthinking machines.
The ship is going down, and you only have time to grab one item and take it with you to the lifeboat. A sheet of plastic, a mirror, and a compass. Which do you choose?
My interviewer leaned forward expectantly, his hand paused above his notepad. I said, This is a shelf-stacking job. I'm not applying to the Ocean Cruise Department.
Just say plastic to collect rainwater, he replied wearily. Didn't you Google the answers before you came?
Plastic to collect rainwater. He tapped the final box, and I heard a somber chime.
I'm sorry, he said. You didn't make the cut.
Why not? He glanced down at the screen.
No stability in your employment history, and honestly, you're too old.
I looked around his office, desperate for an idea. A poster showed a celebrity chef reaching down into a carton of plump apricots, though even a try couldn't have missed the bizarre retouching of the fruit's appearance. Can I show you something? I offered. In the produce aisles?
What are you talking about?
I could save the company thousands of dollars a month, I boasted. If something's on the verge of going rotten or infested with insects. My interviewer was smiling. He shook his head in disbelief, or perhaps a trace of admiration in my chutzpah. At my chutzpah.
He said, Sorry, we already have that app.
I looked up the app. It wouldn't work on older phones, like my own, but the very latest models now carried reconfigurable quantum dot cameras as standard. It was not just art galleries and DIY card sharks who could access the whole spectrum. Early adopters could do it already, and in 5 years it would be ubiquitous. Phones, notepads, glasses, even every small, cheap camera would soon be seeing more of the world than its human owner. After Lucy's last day at the gallery, her colleagues took us out to dinner. I sat watching them, feigning bonhomie, laughing when everyone else laughed. One man took a photograph of his steak to assess its rareness and quantify the risk of food poisoning. A woman looked around furtively, then snapped the dessert, in the hope of recreating it at home. These people would never learn to see the world for themselves, but they were already accustomed to asking their gadgets to advise them every few minutes. Lucy glared at me as if I was someone's mad uncle at a wake. My mother had watched Zelda for us. When Lucy and I were alone, I said, "Remember the treasure hunts?" She groaned. "Oh, please, not the good old days." I said, "Do you still have the recipes for the inks that you used?" "Why?" Then she understood. "It would only be a fad," she said. "A novelty. We'd be lucky if it lasted a year." A fad can make a lot of money in a year. Software, posters, spray cans, marker pens, clothing, tattoos. A whole secret world that's hidden from ordinary eyes. But not some virtual reality overlay. Solid objects you can touch with your bare hands. Lucy was skeptical. "And whose kidney are you going to sell to fund this empire?" I said, "We're going to need a backer. Someone who will understand the idea. So let's hope my cousin hasn't blown all his prize money." Chapter 3. Zelda stretched her arms above her head and waved her hands at me impatiently. "Lift me, Daddy!" She wouldn't let me carry her comfortably on my hip, or even riding on my shoulders. She had to be gripped under the arms and held up at chest height, half a meter ahead of me, like a kind of advanced scout, seeing everything moments before I did. "You're getting too old for this," I told her, as I staggered through the gallery's automatic doors. "No, you are." "That's true as well." I put her down, and she ran toward Lucy, stopping shyly at the sight of the two strangers talking with her mother. Lucy smiled at her, and so did the customers, but then they all turned back to the painting. "You've captured the river perfectly," the woman marveled, making a sliding gesture beside her glasses to shift between false color renderings. "Whatever wavelengths I map, the natural detail's there." "That's what I was aiming for," Lucy replied.
How long did it take you?
The woman's partner asked. "About a year." Lucy glanced at me, but I kept a poker face.
I can believe that.
I stood back and waited for her to clinch the sale. Tries can never really join us in the wider world, but having learned to peek out through the keyhole of their prison and take in the view incrementally, they're no longer willing to spend their whole lives staring at blank stone walls. The individual gimmicks come and go. The TV shows with points of view mimicking multispectral glasses, the plays where the actors have trained to emote with their capillaries for suitably equipped audiences, the advertising signs with secret messages that seem more profound and persuasive after the 5-second hunt across the rainbow that it takes to reveal them, and the need, among the sufficiently wealthy, to hang a picture on the wall that actually resembles the thing it portrays. When the customers had left with their painting, Lucy took off her shoes and sat down wearily on the gallery's fashionably white bench. It was covered with her buttock prints, and mine, but we varied the location to form a tasteful pattern.
I want to do some drawings,
Zelda demanded. Lucy sighed, feigning reluctance, but then she fetched a stack of paper and the bucket of pencils she kept out in the back. Zelda sat on the floor, carefully choosing among the 600 hues on offer. She drew a garden of striped flowers, 3 stick figures with wildly mottled faces, and then above it all began meticulously shading in the bands of an 11 o'clock sky. And that was Seventh Sight by Greg Egan. That one's a cute one. It's a heart warmer. So they did give their child heptochromatic vision. That's what heps mean. And then tris are trichromatic, which is us, baselines. Red, green, blue. What time is it? Oh, yeah, we'll do another one. We have time now for Break My Fall. And I don't remember this one at all. I don't know what this one's about.
so it'll be a surprise to all of us. It has been.
When did this come out? When was this published? This collection came out in 2020. I got it about then. So it has been 4 or 5 years. It has been 4 years since I've read this. Regrettably, I have not gotten around to rereading it in that time. Usually I have a faster turnaround, but with a book collection as sizable as mine, this stuff slows down a bit. I don't think I had a special cover for this one. Give me a moment to double check here. Here we go. No, no. I do have one for next week. Nope, nope, I don't. Okay, so we'll just go with the cover scene here today and most of the other weeks is I just lost my train of thought. That's embarrassing. is the same as the one that I've got. Um, Come on, there we go. Let me get this where it belongs. I think that's it. Alrighty. So give me a sec to rehydrate, and we'll get cracking. Break My Fall by Greg Egan. The 15th stepping stone came into view behind the baza, pairs of spokes glinting as they caught the sun. At this distance nothing else was visible, but Heng had no trouble picturing the stone's topography from these flickering splinters of light. Each turning spoke whose anchor point lay in the asteroid's day side was partly hidden behind the rock as it crossed the angle where it offered its mirror flash, while its opposite number rising up from the night side lay partly in shadow. A perfect sphere would have taken equal bites out of the two lines, but the stone, that's with a capital S, as is the S in stepping, But the stone revealed its misshapen peanut form in the dark gap's cycle of shifts and asymmetries. Heng glanced away from the window toward Darpana, 2 couches from his own in the square of 9 bunks. Most children enjoyed a fairground ride. Most children enjoyed a fairground ride, but this roller coaster was relentless, and her vitals log showed that she still hadn't slept in the 24 hours since the boarding. With one elbow propping her head up from the couch against the elastic tug of her harness, Darpana did not look tired, let alone distressed. But if she didn't nod off soon, Heng would have to talk to her grandmother about giving her a sedative. The stone's rocky core was visible now, its outline mutating as it spun, like a pallid gray half moon reflected in a trembling puddle. The asteroid was approaching at an absurdly slow rate by astronomical standards, outpacing them by a mere 50 meters a second. They might have been back on Earth, hurtling along a railway line, albeit in some surreal ghost train ride where a turnstile wrapped around a giant boulder threatened to block their way. But as the boulder drew closer and the Baza pressed between the 2 layers of cables that stretched out from the rock, any sense of a horizontal passage skirting the obstacle vanished. They were swerving around it, but they were swerving upward. Darpana's gleeful cry was barely audible, but to Heng it sounded subdued more out of consideration for her fellow passengers than from any lack of energy or enthusiasm. As their weight shot up from nothing toward a G1/2, he could see her grimace with delight, as if the visceral thrill that had gripped her the first time remained as intense as ever. The portions of the cables nearest to them were traveling backward with the asteroid's spin, putting them almost at rest with respect to the Baza, and the eddy currents induced in them by the ship's magnets served as a brake, quickly dragging the relative velocity down to 0. Within seconds, the Baza was firmly locked to the cables at 2 points, swinging along with them, but still free to pivot around its center of mass and stay true to its original alignment. While the stars beyond the window remained serene and motionless against the frame of the cabin's interior, the 9 bunks turned like roasting spits, swiveling to remain horizontal under the shifting centrifugal gravity. The view that had lain to Heng's left was dropping below him. The whole ship, and the whole cosmos beyond, seemed to be rotating around the fixed axis of his spine. In 10 seconds they'd completed half a circle, and the stars were rising on his right. He tensed himself for the fall of release, but the navigator opted for another full turn as it worked to refine their course, ensuring that the next encounter would be as perfectly aligned as this one. As Heng gazed up at the stars, they were replaced by a blur of rock, sunlit for a moment, then fading to black and slipping away. When the stars rose for a second time, the navigator finally broke its grip on the cables, and Heng's surroundings stopped tumbling. The stone came into view on his right, retreating, the stars behind it unchanged. The Baza had performed a U-turn around the stone, but with respect to the Earth, rather than reversing its motion. Okay, one sec. Sometimes when we have a sentence that's rather complicated, with a lot of information, I have to reread it, because my brain goes on autopilot, and my lips go on autopilot. I performed a U-turn around the stone, but with respect to the Earth, rather than reversing its motion, it had Let's try it again. Sorry, sometimes this happens. One of the disadvantages of doing this live is that sometimes we get lost in the sauce. The Baza had performed its U-turn around the stone, but with respect to the Earth, rather than reversing its motion. Okay. There we go. This is why reading out loud actually is good, as we figure it out. The Baza had performed a U-turn around the stone, but with respect to the Earth, rather than reversing its motion, it had just gained an extra 100 meters a second. Over the next hour, the stone would give a similar boost to every ship in the convoy, and then it would be free to spend a couple of years harvesting sunlight, replenishing its spin and tweaking its orbit until it was back in position to reprise its role for another group of travelers. It had taken 3 decades to nudge this rock and its companions out of the Amor group and into their tailored orbits, but the foresight of the pioneers who'd begun the process had paid off for the generation that followed. The Baza was not so much a spacecraft in its own right as a life support capsule being tossed from stone to stone, but this choreographed relay race would deliver it to Mars in just 4.5 months. Shoot, that's pretty good. 4.5 months. Well, that depends on where Mars is in relation to Earth at this point. So if they're doing it at the short, that's still really good, considering they're not using like chemical rockets. Damn. Sorry. Because I think that's like what it would take now, right? With chemical rockets with currently existing tech? Maybe less. Still, that's pretty good considering you're just using basically being flung off of rocks, not slingshotting. So, well, kind of slingshotting. Sorry. But this choreographed relay race would deliver it to Mars in just 4.5 months. Rohini addressed her granddaughter calmly. You should sleep now, darling, if you can. But it's exciting, Darpana protested. It is, Rohini agreed, but we have 30 more days just like this ahead of us, and if you make yourself sick, you won't enjoy them at all. Darpana was silent, but then she seemed to accept the argument. I'll try to sleep before the next one. Good girl. Rohini relaxed back onto her couch. Darpana looked past her and caught Heng's gaze. He smiled, then let his eyelids grow heavy, hoping the action would be as contagious as a yawn but less obviously manipulative. By the time he thought it might be safe to check whether he'd had any success, he'd fallen into a warm half-sleep himself, ready to wake in an instant if the Baza required it, but unwilling to surface for anything less. You think pneumatic tube trains are cool? This is a whole new level. It only took a small change to the sunside window's tint to brighten the cabin and bring on a notional dawn. Heng rose before any of the passengers to use the toilet, sponge his body, and change his clothes. When the Baza finally reached the 100th stepping stone and they climbed aboard for the middle stage of the journey, it would feel as if they'd gone from a shanty boat to a luxury ocean liner. But until then, these few minutes each day would be the pinnacle of privacy. As he swung out of the ablutions room, he was hit by the glorious aroma of someone's breakfast sizzling in the microwave. Only Iqbal and Noor were in the kitchen nook, but the other passengers were stirring, woken by the smell. Do you feel like sharing? Heng inquired. The couple's meal looked like some kind of spiced omelet rotating in its sealed bag under the lights, and though Heng had dozens of cherished recipes of his own, the sensory appeal of this visible, olfactable reality was far stronger than any remembered culinary delight. Of course. Iqbal turned toward the couches, swiveling on his handhold. Anyone else? There was a deafening chorus of requests, and Iqbal waved the count up from 2 to 9. Heng was pleased. So far as he knew, there was no acrimony between any of the families traveling on the convoy, but the smallest sign that they weren't going to turn clicky on him was welcome. Company policy was to allow no more than 3 related people on the same ship, to ensure that a single ruptured hull could take only a limited toll from each family. But the resulting assortment of traveling companions had made his last outward journey an ordeal, as he'd struggled to keep the members of 2 rival clans from goading each other into violence. Whether Mars itself would prove big enough for the both of them was, mercifully, not his problem. Everyone managed to get through breakfast before the klaxons warned that Stone 19 was on its way. Heng looked on solicitously as Rohini helped Darpana into her harness, but they didn't need his assistance. They'd both been rated as diligent by their trainer in the course back in Shanghai. Dozens of children had made the trip over the years, and Heng had flown in convoys with a few of them, but he'd never had anyone so young on his own ship. The log showed that Darpana had slept deeply, and as they tumbled around the first stone of the new day, she whooped with unabashed pleasure. Once they were weightless again, Heng climbed free and set about the first round of systems inspections, starting with the laundry press and moving through all the water recycling components. It was tedious work, and this early in the trip it was hard not to assume complacently that nothing could yet have grown clogged, infested, or leaky, but he had his cans improvise some rousing percussive music, invigorating but not catchy enough to be distracting, and he managed to get through the tasks without a single nagging beep from the overseer. When he was done, Heng, Heng cast his gaze around the cabin. I lost my place, I'm sorry. When he was done, cast his gaze around the cabin, reassuring himself that everything was in order. Aquila was using the spring set, grunting softly as she forced her legs straight against the machine's tug, then fighting just as hard to bend them again. Heng's exercise of choice was running, in the middle stage, when he had the freedom of the stone's corridors. But the Baz's zero-G treadmill was a poor substitute, and in a space as small as this, it just left him feeling more hemmed in. The drugs that lied to his muscle fibers and osteocytes, assuring them that they were still bearing their usual loads, seemed to be enough to keep him from any drastic decline in his weightless months. Everyone else remained on their couches. Iqbal and Noor were facing each other, smiling slightly, conversing privately, or sharing an overlay. Rohini had her eyes closed, but Heng had no reason to snoop on her vitals to check if she dozed off or was merely engrossed in some study or entertainment. Punita, Abid, and Chandrakant were all clearly in that state, staring attentively into the middle distance. Only Darpana was looking out the window. She saw Heng's reflection on the glass and turned toward him.
Are we in front of the Tragopan or behind now? I've lost track.
In front.
My cousin said he'd aim his laser pointer out the window.
Hung doubted that she'd be able to spot it, but if hunting for a faint red speck against the stars helped her pass the time, he wasn't going to disillusion her. Darpana had another question for him.
Why do the orbits for the stepping stones stick out so much?
Ah. Heng summoned an overlay of the asteroid's trajectories. Darpana joined the view and gestured at the largest of the ellipses traced out on the illusory pane between them.
We only want to get from Earth to Mars, she said, so why do half the orbits go further?
What do you think would be more sensible? He challenged her. Darpana replied boldly,
Just start with Earth's orbit and make it bigger, step by step, until you've reached Mars.
Show me, Heng suggested. He cleared the stones from the pane, leaving only the two planets. Darpana drew a sequence of a dozen concentric circles, bridging the gap in equal increments.
If I draw hundreds, it will be hard to see what is going on, she explained.
No, that's fine, I get the idea. Heng waited to see if she'd spot any problems for herself, then he pointed out gently, None of these orbits cross each other, do they?
No.
Darpana didn't understand the complaint.
Why should they? The stepping stones don't need to meet up. If the orbits are close enough, they could still throw the ships to each other.
So the stepping stones have one kind of orbit, these circles, but the ships move between them on different kinds of orbits?
Darpana hesitated.
Yes.
How different?
Darpana sketched a short line from one circle to another.
That's the kind of path we should take, straight out to the next stone, like throwing a ball up to your friend on a balcony. Then she throws it to someone on the balcony above, and on it goes all the way to the roof.
Heng could see the appeal of this metaphor, but the reality wasn't much harder to grasp.
One small problem. he said, is that you'd need a phenomenal velocity to go straight up like that. Remember, these stones are in orbit, so your first one will be moving sideways at about 30 kilometers a second.
Right.
Darpana took his point and erased her original line, replacing it with a curve that spiraled around at a modest pitch on its way out from the sun.
How's that? The stone above is moving sideways too, so it still ought to be able to catch the ship.
How far apart are these orbits? Hung asked.
I'm not sure, Darpana confessed. How far can a stone throw us?
If you throw something at 50 meters a second from the Earth's orbit, it will travel 250 million kilometers outward before it starts falling back toward the sun.
That's plenty, Darpana replied. A few hundred steps like that would get you to Mars.
The catch, Hung said, is that each step would take about 3 months.
Darpana's spiral had an implausibly steep ascent. He sketched in an elliptical arc that hewed closer to the initial circle, wrapping a quarter of the way around the sun before reaching aphelion. That's aphelion, Aphelion.
Of course, you could always space your stones closer than this and catch the ship while it's still moving outward, but so long as the stones themselves aren't moving outward, the ships can't build up speed in that direction. They'll be forced to cross the whole gap between the orbits at 50 meters a second or less.
Darpana gazed at her concentric circles, an endless set of speed bumps if you tried to cut across them. So the trip would take decades this way?
Yes.
Heng brought back the real stone's orbits.
We want to head out as fast as we can, which in the middle stage is so fast that if we kept it up, we'd overshoot Mars completely. The stones need to move on similar orbits to us, so some of them do need to overshoot Mars. You can't just take Earth's orbit and enlarge it step by step. You need to squeeze it, making it longer and skinnier, so it carries you away from the sun.
I think I understand now, Darpana smiled. I'll try explaining it to Lomash and see if I can make him believe. And see if I can make him believe me, then I'll know I've got the hang of it.
Heng closed the overlay and left her to commune with the Tragopan, her lips moving silently. It was a shame that her cousin couldn't have been on the same ship, but the two could still chat endlessly and compare their different views of this leg of the voyage. Heng couldn't understand how the girl's parents could have left her behind in the first place, but they'd all be reunited soon enough. The ever-growing warrens of Cydonia Station would be a rich playground for an imaginative child, and if in adulthood she wanted to return to Earth's wider horizons, there'd be nothing stopping her. His overseer buzzed a reminder. It was time to start checking the air scrubbers.
The weather's turning, Liana announced grimly. There's still a chance that you'll be able to ride it out to the mid-stage, but you'd better start getting the passengers accustomed to the possibility of taking shelter early.
Hung stared at the delicate yellow Sorry. Heng stared at the delicate yellow lacework of coronal loops beside her on the overlay. Before they'd set out, the models had promised them a quiet journey, with just enough solar activity to limit the incursion of cosmic rays. A healthy solar wind repelled a fair proportion of the high-velocity particles from interstellar sources, and the trade-off was usually worth it, with the sun's own slower protons not too hard to block. But a coronal mass ejection could form shock waves that accelerated the normally tolerable windup. Sorry. But a coronal mass ejection could form shock waves that accelerated the normally tolerable wind. Normally tolerable. There, I think I said it right before, but my brain didn't think I did. Let's try this all over again. I'm so sorry. But a coronal mass ejection could form shock waves that accelerated the normally tolerable wind up to energies that would penetrate the ship's hulls. If that happened, only meters of solid rock could protect them.
What's the worst case? Lay asked. His worried face faded into view beside Liana's as he spoke.
2 days warning, she replied. The models aren't perfect, but they've never failed to spot an impending CME once it was that close.
Hung listened as the other captains questioned her, seeking reassurances that she could not provide. Nobody's life was in danger. The next stepping stone would never be more than 20 hours away. But if the travelers were forced to accept the nearest sanctuary, they'd have no hope of reaching their scheduled mid-stage ride. At best, they'd face a massively expensive extraction mission, a fully powered ship launched from Mars orbit, if the families could afford it. If not, all the company itself could offer them was 2 years or more hunkering down in their shelter until enough stones could be brought into position to allow them to resume their journey, or to form an off-ramp taking them back to Earth. When the conference ended, Heng was left staring at the grid of couches in front of him. There weren't enough cubic meters of air in the baza to dissipate the stench of his sweat. "I have an announcement," he said, more loudly than he'd intended, but no one showed any sign of having heard him. He gestured to shut off their overlays and cans, and the passengers shifted in surprise on their bunks. Heng explained the forecast and the possibilities ahead.
"The one sure thing is that we won't be taken by surprise," he stressed. "The conditions on the sun are being monitored in real time by a dozen satellites, and the models can predict these mass ejections very reliably, days in advance. Whatever's coming our way, we'll know about it in plenty of time."
Chandrakant was indignant.
In time for what? To imprison ourselves? Why didn't you astronomers see this coming before we left?
"I'm very sorry,"
Heng said. He doubted that it would help to start debating the reasons why the long-range forecasts couldn't be perfect.
"We still have a chance of reaching the mid-stage, but we need to be ready either way."
What kind of facilities do the other stones have? Punita asked anxiously. What kind of food? What kind of space for us?
"The interiors are all identical," Heng assured her, "and they're all stockpiled with supplies."
He almost said to last for decades, but thought better of it.
"For as long as we could possibly need."
But this is nothing for you," Chandrakant declared bitterly. "Where else would you be? Is just life as normal?"
His brother Abid muttered something to him in Gujarati. Hung only knew Hindi, but the tone sounded reproving. Abid addressed Hung in English.
This is nobody's fault. Every traveler faces these risks.
"It's a shock," Heng said, "but what can we do?"
We'll make the best of it, Rohini replied firmly. Hope for a reprieve and make the best of what comes.
Heng finally dared to glance toward Darpana. She was 10 years old. 2 years cooped up inside an asteroid would feel like a lifetime to her.
Would the whole convoy end up together? She asked. Or would it be some of us in one stone, some in another?
Heng said, "There's a good chance we'd all be together."
If the warning came as early as expected, they wouldn't have to settle for the very next stone on their itinerary, regardless. Yes, I did read that correctly. If the warning came as early as expected, they wouldn't have to settle for the very next stone on their itinerary, regardless of whether or not the rest of the convoy had already left it behind.
That's all right then, Darpana ruled amiably. On Mars, we'd be underground most of the time anyway.
She gripped the sides of her couch and turned her body around to face the window. Heng watched the other passengers dialing down their angst. If this child wasn't going to shed a tear or throw a tantrum, it would be shameful for them to make a greater fuss themselves.
Do you have a big family?
Akela asked Heng as she moved a piece across the backgammon board overlaid between them.
"Just my parents," he replied. "I can't afford to marry yet. Maybe after a couple more trips."
Akela looked surprised. Perhaps she'd overestimated the portion of her fare that was ending up in his pocket.
And then you'll settle back on Earth?
"Yes, I'm not the pioneering type."
Ha! She gestured at their Spartan surroundings.
"This is a job," Heng replied. "I don't mind a few small hardships for myself, so long as there's an end in sight."
In 20 years, Cydonia will be more livable than Shanghai,
Akela boasted, rather implausibly.
"You can send me a postcard when it happens."
He hesitated. So what's the attraction for you? Elbow room or ideology? She laughed softly. Both. Humanity needs a permanent settlement away from Earth, and though some people want to postpone that until our descendants are bitstreams with much lower shipping costs, I don't think we should pass up the chance we have right now. But you'll have no relatives on Mars? No, thank goodness. Akela smiled. I come from a family of infuriating I'm sorry. I come from a family of infuriating meddlers who delight in being up to their elbows in each other's business. I love them all, but it's exhausting. On Mars, I'll finally have a chance to breathe. Heng's cans chimed in with an incoming call. Please excuse me. He turned to face the wall. Liana appeared in front of him, and she wasted no time on pleasantries. There's a CME coming, she said. We expect the protons to hit you in about 53 hours. 53 hours. Is it worth waiting for a later
Is it worth waiting for a later stone? Zun asked. In terms of the eventual reconfiguration?
Heng was impressed by her calm demeanor. He could feel his own jaw locked tight, his own thoughts still trapped in a bitter wail of resentment. Could they shorten their time in exile by a judicious choice of stone right now? No, there's nothing to be gained by a delay, Liana replied. We're advising you all to dock with 1740. That was the very next stone they'd encounter, scheduled to catch up with the convoy's hindmost ship in about 4 hours. But the Baza was currently leading the pack, and as ever, the first would be last. When Heng made the announcement, most of the passengers seemed resigned to their fate.
Is there anything special we need to do to prepare?
Punita asked.
Everyone needs to be suited in advance, he said. I know it's awkward doing that weightless, but it's even harder at a G&a-half.
Heng looked to Darpana. She was dutifully trying to appear solemn, but he could tell that she was excited by the news. They were fleeing for their lives from a surge of radiation, but the race was fixed squarely in their favor, and it would soon reunite her with her beloved cousin. With all the thrill of the chase, but no real danger, why shouldn't she revel in it? He struggled to quell his own anger and disappointment, to be grateful for the prospect of safety and put the rest of their problems aside. He'd even ended up with a reasonably harmonious group of inmates to share his sentence in the rock. If this happened on his last run, he might have led to civil war.
Noor said, My parents went around the world twice on their honeymoon, but it looks like I'll be setting a new family record. My parents went around the world twice on their honeymoon, but it looks like I'll be setting a new family record.
Zun's ship, the Monal, was the first to dock with their heavenly Alcatraz. Harnessed to his bunk, Heng watched an overlay of telemetry from the ship as it locked onto the whirling cables and then applied its ion thrusters to end its tumbling relative to the rock. Before the cradle had been winched down from the asteroid to start bringing the passengers inside, the Lapwing had joined the Monal on the opposite spoke. Heng was always nervous when he was approaching a crowded stone, even if the satisfaction of having reached the mid-stage usually took the edge off it. The navigators had had plenty of time to determine the best spoke for each ship and tweak their precise moments of arrival accordingly, but there was no denying that the safety margins shrank each time another obstacle lodged itself between the cables. The Snipe docked smoothly, followed by the Curlew. As Hung watched a schematic of the stone spinning toward the Tragopan, he found himself extrapolating the motion in his mind's eye, picturing the inevitable meshing of ship and reserved parking space. The Baza's fit would be no tighter, with neighbors 60 degrees away on either side. In 20 minutes all the stress would be over. In 20 more he'd be sitting around a table joking with his colleagues about their long internment and challenges of remote sex with distant partners as the light speed lag grew longer. The schematic began blinking, and a list of mismatches between the docking plan and real-time sensor readings began scrolling across the margin. Leigh's voice came over the link.
We're not holding. The magnets have. No! The magnets are holding. The cable's come free, and there's rock with it. We've torn off a piece of the asteroid.
Heng switched to a radar image of the Tragopan falling away from Alcatraz, a 400-meter length of cable twirling lopsidedly around it. He couldn't tell if the cable had swiped the Curlew on its way into the void, but the Doppler annotations on the image warned that all the remaining spokes were now swaying dangerously, pendulums set quivering by this seismic disruption. Shen spoke. Oh, sorry.
Jeez, there's a tickling at the back of my throat. I don't know what that's all about. I'm hydrated. Oh no, don't lose the bookmark. I need that. Sorry about that. I try not to do that into the mic. Shen spoke from the Curlew. We're all right here, swinging like a chandelier, but nothing's broken. Zun?
The stone.
Oh, Zun is a woman. Whatever.
The stone's maintaining pressure, she replied. One airlock is gone, but the bulkheads have sealed the breach. Leigh, what's your status? Shutting down the magnets,
Leigh replied tersely. Though both ship and cable were in free fall, the combined system had been rotating. Severing the link would fling them apart, with no guarantee of a clean separation. Heng stared at the radar for a few tense seconds as Leigh fired his ion thrusters and managed to maneuver the Tragopan out of harm's way. Heng's attention snapped back to his own problems. The pair of cables that the Baza had been meant to grab were oscillating back and forth, and though the radar could track this motion and the navigator could model its gradual damping, the uncertainties were so great that if the ship tried to dock now, there was no guarantee of completing the process safely. Heng absorbed the numbers and then issued the command himself before the navigator intervened and made the decision for him. Abort docking, he subvocalized. He waited for confirmation that they were steering clear of Alcatraz, then he banished the overlay and pulled himself out of his harness.
We've had a change of plan, he announced. We'll be docking at the next stone instead.
The passengers had trained for this scenario in Shanghai, so they all knew exactly what it would entail.
Why? Darpana demanded. You said we'd be with everyone else.
The cables have developed a problem.
Heng saw a flag in his peripheral vision. Darpana was requesting a passenger-to-passenger link with the Tragopan. He refused it.
We have 2 hours, so you can de-suit for a bit if you want to.
Rohini was looking worried, but she turned to her granddaughter.
Will you help me get out of this suit so I can wash? I want to feel fresh before I'm stuck in it again for who knows how long.
Once Rohini and Darpana were in the ablutions room, Iqbal approached Heng.
What happened exactly?
The Tragopan broke its mooring.
Was anyone hurt?
No.
So how do they get back to the stone? Akila asked.
They still have their ion thrusters.
Heng couldn't meet her gaze.
But that will take forever, she said.
It will take days, Heng replied. They'll get back, but it's going to take days.
Heng tried to push the fate of the Tragopan out of his mind and focus on his own responsibilities. The passengers had been assigned partners to check each other's suits, but he followed up with checks of his own. The suits were meant to be able to monitor their own integrity, but then so were the stones, and if the smallest leak could be perilous in a normal disembarkation, the harsher version they were about to attempt could turn any flaw into a fatality. As they took their places in the bunks, he could see the grief in Rohini's posture and the confusion and resentment in Darpana's. Rohini had told Heng that she'd explain everything to her granddaughter once they were out of the Baza. Until then, the other passengers were doing their best to conceal their own distress. Hung caught sight of the fallback stone, approaching at 3 times the usual speed. It was like being strapped to a bullet that had been aimed at the edge of a throwing star. The Baza was on a trajectory that would pass between the cables almost at their tips, so there was no margin for error. If they were half a meter further from their target than intended, the magnets would get no purchase, and they'd pass on by, as doomed as the Tragopan. He watched an overlay of the navigator iteratively refining its model of the encounter as better radar measurements came in, and the ghostly blue error cone around the trajectory grew ever narrower. But the error that would kill them would be invisible, an undetected crack deep in the machinery that would announce itself only at the instant it became impossible to rectify. The stone's core shot out of view from the window beside the bunks, and the sunside window on the adjoining wall was too heavily tinted to reveal anything meaningful. Hung held his breath and desperately willed his body to be crushed. The 4.5 Gs slammed him down instantly. As the magnets grazed the cable's extremities, they'd had no chance to ease the ship smoothly up to the full centrifugal weight. The Tragopan had torn free at 1/3 of this load. What right did he have to expect the Baza to hold? But it did. Hung lay pinned to his couch, his ribs burning with the effort of each breath, the cabin turning around him. Gradually, the ion thrusters killed the spin. The room stopped moving, and there was a satisfying thud as the docking magnets gripped the cables at 2 more points, doubling the strength of the Baza's hold. There was nothing to do now but wait for the stone to invite them in. Hung's status overlay showed the cradle inching its way down from the rock toward the ship. Strange, bright points streaked across his vision, but he couldn't tell if it was his contacts or his retinas that were hallucinating fireworks under the strain. He wondered what kind of light show they'd see on the Tragopan when solar protons boosted by the CME shockwave crashed through their vitreous humor and into their brains. Ye old Cherenkov radiation. Hung felt his suit puff out around his forearms, the air it contained no longer opposed by the cabin's pressure. The Baza's hatch slid open, admitting a silver light reflected from the rock above that cycled between full moon brightness and pitch black 3 times a minute. According to the overlay, the cradle was almost in place. Hung was half tempted to send Darpana up first, to spare the girl any more time under the punishing gravity, but the protocols were clear. If anything was amiss up on the asteroid, it couldn't be a passenger dealing with it, let alone a child. The captain had to be the first to leave the ship, however unchivalrous that seemed. A chime sounded in his cans, and he focused on the flashing message in his overlay. The cradle was touching the Baza's hull, but it was misaligned by a few centimeters, stopping it from passing through the hatch. The fucking thing had an air jet to deal with that kind of problem. What did the stone expect him to do? Not even Aquila could have climbed up and helped the cradle through the entrance. Hung squinted at the image his contacts were painting until the final line of text became clear. The airjet had been tried, but it wasn't working. Either the nozzle was blocked, or a control wire had been severed. "Navigator," he subvocalized, "compute the thrust to reposition us 10 centimeters along the y-axis." They were hanging from the asteroid like a dead weight on a string, but they ought to be able to shift the equilibrium. The force required was within the thruster's capacity. Hung had it build up as slowly as he could bear, giving time for the cables to dissipate energy so he wouldn't set the Baza swinging. After 10 minutes, the cradle dropped down into the cabin, and the winch positioned it next to Heng's bunk. His harness disconnected from the couch beneath him. The cradle locked onto it at the side and slid him over into the suspended sling. He rose up in airless silence, unable to turn his gaze to the side to look across at the stars. All he could see was the rock straight above him, cycling through its 10-second days and nights. A lighthouse, a prison, a safe port for all the loneliness and grief to come. Will you talk to her? Rohini pleaded. She trusts you.
Trusts me? Hung was confused. She can't believe you'd lie about something like this.
He could hear Darpana's wailing, rising and falling like a song. Not deliberately, Rohini replied. But you're the expert. If you explain to her why there's nothing we can do, she'll believe you. When I tell her the same, she just screams that I don't know what I'm talking about. Heng gathered his courage and strode down the corridor. The child had brought joy and innocence to the Baza, but now it was his duty to help her understand her cousin's fate. He knocked on the door of Darpana's cabin. She stopped her keening, and he heard her spring up off the bed. When she slid the door open, she did not look surprised. Rohini must have promised to send him to talk to her. "Why aren't we rescuing them?" she demanded. "Why aren't we going after them?"
If we met up with them, how would that help? Heng asked gently. Our thrusters are no stronger than theirs.
Darpana stared at him contemptuously. "We don't just have our thrusters," she replied. "We have this whole stone. We can throw the Baza in any direction at 150 meters per second."
Yes, Hung agreed, so we could reach the Tragopan quickly, but what good is that if we can't match its speed? And if we did match its speed, we'd all be in the same boat.
Darpana said, "We don't match speed with the stones, do we?" Heng rubbed his eyes. He was still giddy from all the changes in weight.
We do, though. We match speed with the cables.
She knew that perfectly well, but he couldn't blame her for saying or thinking anything as she sought some miraculous reprieve. Heng had met Lomash briefly before the convoy set out from orbit, but now he tried to wipe the boy's smiling face from his mind. Lay would haunt him. That was hard enough. "So we take some cable with us," Darpana retorted, "and spin it as fast as we have to." Hung stood with his arm resting on the doorframe, squinting to try to see past the defects swimming through his eyeballs. Taking cable with them would have sounded like nonsense a day ago, conjuring up an image of him packing a reel of it in the cabin and then trying to deploy it as the rendezvous approached. But the Tragopan had certainly taken cable with it when it ripped a whole double strand loose from Alcatraz. If they could find a safer way to mimic that feat, could they turn the Baza itself into a kind of impromptu stepping stone? The ship wouldn't need to be crewed. It would merely have to cross paths with the Tragopan, carrying enough speed and spin for the Tragopan to effect the necessary U-turn and get back to Alcatraz. One of the 4 docked ships could be sent between the stones to replace the Baza.
Let me think,
he told Darpana. He turned and walked away. Heng contacted Liana first, privately. He did not want to give Lei and the others false hope if the scheme proved impossible from the start. You don't have the tools to slice through nanotube cables, Liana declared bluntly.
Are you certain?
Hung wished he'd queried the inventory first, but if the company didn't want him to have the means to hack a spoke off the stone, the computer would have lied to him anyway.
If this isn't the emergency that justifies some serious vandalism, what is?
It's not about damaging property, Liana replied. Your responsibility is to your own passengers. If you breach the integrity of your living space, you'll just kill 9 more people.
You're right.
Heng cut the link. He was wasting his time with her. The legal position would be crystal clear. The company could not endorse his plan, let alone facilitate it. And he had no right to endanger the Baza's passengers without their consent. Heng gathered everyone in the conference room, Darpana included, and explained precisely what he wanted to do.
We don't have much time to make a decision, he said. If this goes wrong, it might damage the stone badly enough to kill us. Or we might spring a leak and lose pressure, so we'd have to live in suits until we can make repairs.
Or we might get away with it unharmed, Punita suggested.
We might, Heng agreed. Alcatraz had survived its own amputation.
But don't ask me for the odds.
He passed a sheet of paper around the table, with 2 columns to record the votes. Everyone would have the power of veto. He couldn't let a mere majority coerce anyone into risking their life. As Chandrakant accepted the ballot, he looked up at Heng with an expression of pure loathing. Heng shifted his gaze and stared at the far wall. He'd done nothing deliberately to alienate the man, but it was too late now to placate him. Iqbal touched Heng's shoulder. The paper had only taken 30 seconds to come full circle. Heng accepted it and unfolded all the creases that people had made to hide their votes from the next recipient. There were 9 marks in the yes column. Heng organized the passengers into work teams, fetching trolley loads of rubble from a cul-de-sac that the tunneling machines hadn't fully cleaned out. Each courier weighed their contribution on a set of bathroom scales, and Darpana had the job of double-checking the readings and the running total. The company had had the stone's automation disable the motorized winch for the cradle, so Heng and Aquila took turns operating it by hand. A purely mechanical regulator prevented it from unwinding uncontrollably, even as the weight it was bearing quadrupled, and Heng had offset the rope so that the combined centrifugal and Coriolis forces saw it drop squarely into the hatch below. The real effort went into hauling the empty cradle up again. Safety regulations precluded any interference in the airlock's function, and it opened and closed its doors at the push of a button as always. As they delivered each load through the Baza's hatch, spilling it by sheer force of impact since the cradle was playing dumb, Heng waited for the mounting tension in the cables to fracture the stone around him and send him tumbling out into the vacuum. Suitless for the sake of efficiency, at least he'd have a mercifully quick death. He had decided to postpone the call to Leh until the launch was a fait accompli. He knew that if they spoke any sooner, his friend would feel compelled to beg the Baza team not to take the risk. But in purely pragmatic terms, an early warning would make no difference. The Tragopan's navigator couldn't start plotting a rendezvous before the Baza had actually commenced its flight and its precise trajectory was known. Aquila said, "The cradle's stuck. The load's not coming off." Heng joined her at the winch. They strained together against the handle, and abruptly the drum began to move again. When they'd wound up all 400 meters of rope, Heng sprinted down the steps and opened the airlock. The cradle had been torn right off. There was nothing left but frayed strands of polymer. They didn't have time to try to secure a more robust platform to the rope. They'd have to go ahead with exactly as much rock as they'd delivered. Aquila caught up with him and took stock of the situation. "I'll go down and finish things off," she said. "No, I need you up here to haul me back." Aquila shook her head. "People can work the winch 2 at a time, even 3 at a time. If we lose you, we wouldn't last a month in this place." Heng's skin prickled with shame. He'd seen her vitals log from the docking. There was no doubt that her heart was stronger than his, and her cerebral blood flow would be less compromised by the punishing weight at the rope's end. "I can't let you do it," he said. "I'm terrified enough as it is," she replied. "Don't make it any harder." Heng's shame deepened, but the source had shifted. What mattered to him more, emerging from this disaster with his pride intact, or giving the survivors the best chance he could? He was not indispensable, but he couldn't deny that his absence would make their long exile more dangerous. "All right," he said. Heng sat in the conference room, looking through Aquila's eyes while Iqbal, Chandrakant, and Abid fought her growing weight. The winch's regulator alone would have kept her from falling freely, but her arrival at the Baza would have been fatally abrupt if no other force had slowed her descent. Aquila was staring straight down from her improvised sling. As the sky reeled past behind the ship's silhouette, her helmet's faceplate sent the same rainbow sliver of of refracted colors flickering across her vision before it tinted in response to the sunlight 3 times a minute. The company had disabled the utility robots that could have done the job in her place, ensuring that if this folly led to deaths, they could not be treated as accomplices. "Are you all right?" Heng asked. "I'm glad I haven't eaten for a while," she replied. "If you want to close your eyes until you reach the Baza—" "No, I want to see where I'm going. If I close my eyes, I'll feel like I'm being lowered down a well." As her weight approached 3 Gs, Heng saw the sky shudder. The rope had slipped a few centimeters, then been caught. He brought up an inset of all the winch operator's vitals. Iqbal's heart rate had risen dangerously high, and his breathing was labored. "Punita, you need to relieve Iqbal." Heng spoke on an open channel to everyone, in the hope of precluding any arguments. Iqbal did not dispute the call. When the Baza filled the view, Akila's helmet lamp came on, its steady beam drowning out the rise and fall of asteroid light. Heng gazed down through the hatch. He could see the rubble piled up below, and a hint of white that must have been the broken cradle. As Akila drew level with the hatch, Heng called, "Stop!" to the winch team. Her orientation had looked perfect as she'd approached, so if her right arm was still resting at the edge of the sling, the lever that would close the hatch ought to be well within her reach. "Akila?" "I'm ready," she sub-vocalized, wasting no breath on speech. "Are you clowns ready to get me clear?" Chandrakant replied, "Absolutely." Heng called out the cues they'd agreed on. 1, 2, lever. 3, 4, raise. His viewpoint jerked upward as the door slid shut, centimeters below Akila's face. Well done. He could feel his own heart thumping now. The welding laser tucked under Akila's left arm couldn't burn through the nanotube cable, but it could certainly raise its temperature. She managed to turn her head to face the cable, switch the laser on at its lowest power, and then nudge the beam back and forth until a small red spot could be seen shimmering on the cable 4 meters away. With the stone's computing resources out of bounds, Heng had modeled everything on Darpana's wristwatch. He raised the device from the table beside him and counted down to the moment when the predicted time lag to release would see the Baza move off on a course that the Tragopan could intercept. 3, 2, 1. The laser spot became dazzling for a moment, then Akila's faceplate darkened to tame it. Heng glanced down at the wristwatch and it streamed an animation to his contacts, showing the modeled temperature profile of the cable and the attached magnets. The magnets could function well above room temperature, so they had no special cooling system, but their superconductor's transition temperature was not hard to reach. As a patch of the false color image shifted from blue to green, Akila's bright target vanished, and Heng heard a high-pitched whine from the rock around him. The Baza had lost its grip on one half of the spoke to which it had been docked, but the 2 pieces formed a continuous length of cable, looped through a U-shaped tunnel in the stone. Unbalanced, and bearing more weight than it had ever been intended to hold, the cable was unthreading, the unburdened end rushing up toward the dock while the Baza dragged the other end farther away, increasing its centrifugal weight even more. The noise of the cable scraping through the rock stopped abruptly. The Baza would be falling free now, with Lux still attached to the cable. The timing looked good, within half a second of the model's prediction. The trajectory would lie within the Tragopan's reach. Lei and his passengers would have a second chance of reaching shelter. Heng called out triumphantly, "We did it!" Exuberant cheers came back from the winch team, from Iqbal and Noor, from Rohini and Darpana. Akila was silent, but she'd be saving her breath for the celebrations when she returned. Heng looked through her eyes again as he prepared his words of thanks. He saw the stars, and then he saw the stone, its spokes glinting in the sunlight as it receded into the distance. and that was Break My Fall by Greg Egan. First published in Reach for Infinity in 2014. And Seventh Sight was first published in Upgraded, which came out in 2014. Okay, so that one was a bit of a bummer. Poor Aquila. But I guess her sacrifice. So yeah, at the end of that, I'm pretty sure she's flying away from the stone. And unfortunately, that is not going to end well for her, unless some miracle can transpire somewhere else. But still, that one was a nice rip-roaring, MacGyvering your way into rescuing a bunch of people. Anyway, that'll do it for today. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you didn't tune in, I forgive you. I'm kidding. If you're listening to this after the fact and you want to know why it's so rough, it's because I do these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, or UTC minus 5. Noon UTC minus 5. Yeah. Next week we'll have more of this. We'll have The Nearest, which is it's going to be a bit off-putting. It has implications, but it's a pretty good one. Let's see. What other stuff do we have scheduled at the moment? Mondays are Mecha Mondays, where we do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now we're going through the famous/infamous Starship Troopers by the man, the myth, the legend, Robert Heinlein. I think we're finally starting to get to the divisive bits, but also like their PT training. All their training, so much training, which is understandable. Goodness knows I've got enough cover images to make that one last forever, but I'm going to have to start doing more than one per. Let's see. Wednesdays right now we're going through A Hero Born, which is book 1 of Legends of the Condor Heroes by Jin Yong or Louis Cha, depending on which name you wish to use. Actually, I think next week will be our last installment. It's going to be a pretty long one because I've got the appendices to cover as well, and those have some fairly relevant information on how the translation was done. And the final chapter is just a giant roller coaster. They're all roller coasters, but this one's going to be nuts. It's great. It's awesome. It's phenomenal. It's great. I love it. It's what convinced me, oh man, I've got to get the rest of the books in this series. I was like, yeah, let's go. At any rate, that'll do it for me. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all next time.